judges ready? And the timer? All right, then I'll begin. Governor Rick Perry said recently, quote, "I believe we can take an approach that is both tough and smart. There are thousands of nonviolent offenders in the system whose future we cannot ignore. Let's focus more resources on rehabilitating those offenders so we can ultimately spend less money locking them up again," end quote. Over the course of this speech, I'm going to show why I agree with Rick Perry's stance that we should rehabilitate offenders so we can ultimately spend less money locking them up again. Now, the first argument I'd like to address is the negative team's argument against our weighing mechanism. They said they agree with net benefits, however, they believe they should be significant net benefits. While we do believe that ours are, in fact, significant net benefits, they do not have to be significant net benefits. If our plan is better than the status quo, it makes sense that we should vote for our plan. It doesn't have to be significantly better. If our plan is any better than the status quo, it only makes sense to vote for it. However, I'll go over the rest of the speech, the reasons why I believe our plan is significantly better than the status quo anyway. Now, the next thing I'd like to address is the negative team's topicality argument. Now, the first is they agreed with our mandate 1, which is that the federal government should enact drug courts on the federal level. So this mandate is clearly a federal policy reform. They have not contradicted our first mandate. So even if our second mandate was non-topical, the first mandate should be passed. So that is point number 1. Point number 2 is that of reform versus effect. They talked a lot about how we must make a federal reform and we are making a state reform. However, let's think about the fact that it affects the states. Our second mandate, which affects state drug courts, is an effect to the states. Yet the resolution clearly states that the federal government must be making the reform. And if you look at our agencies, they are the federal government that is actually making the reform. What is the root of the reform? It is all the federal government. The federal government is the enforcement to our plan, so therefore the federal government is making the reform. Now, the second point under this is that of their policy change argument. They said that this is not an actual policy change, this is merely an increase of an already existing policy. No, this is a significant change. We are changing how we deal with 1.2 million drug offenders in our country. This is a significant policy change. It's our policy on how we deal with these drug offenders. 1.2 million, as we brought up earlier, will be dealt with differently as a result of our plan. So this is a significant change in our policy, and the reformer is the federal government. So therefore, our plan is topical in today's debate round. The next point is under vagueness. They said we need to specify exactly how much money will be going to every single state and each drug court. There is simply no time to go through the statistics on how much money will be funded to every single drug court in an 8-minute speech. This is unrealistic. We brought up very specific numbers on how much our plan will cost, how much our plan will save. So we are very specific. They have set an unrealistic standard because there is simply no time in an 8-minute speech, even if that was all I went through, to talk about how much money would be going to each drug court. Now, the next thing I'd like to address is their argument that some people are still ejected from drug courts. This is unfortunate, and we would agree that it is in fact true. Some people are still ejected from drug courts. As my partner brought up, the success rate is 70%, so approximately 30 will be ejected from drug courts if they fail. However, I would like to once again go to net benefits. While 30% fail, 70% succeed. So with the 30% that fail, get the sentence that they would have originally. He stated many times that they would get their original sentence, which means that these people are the same as they would have been in the status quo, whereas we need to focus on the 70% who succeed and are rehabilitated. So the net benefits here show that our plan should be passed. Because of the fact that what happens to those 30% who do get ejected from drug courts go to prison, which is what would have happened to them in the status quo. So this is not actually a disadvantage. It is simply net beneficial, the fact that 70% do succeed in drug courts. Now, the next point is they said that drug courts tend to focus on those who are easy to rehabilitate and not those who really need rehabilitation. Now, this is actually a problem in the status quo, not a problem in our plan. They're trying to uphold the status quo, yet they have brought up a problem with the status quo. Our plan actually intends to solve this problem. We expand drug courts to allow all eligible offenders to enter drug courts. So our plan is specifically attempting to address this problem that they have brought up. This is not a disadvantage with our plan. This is a disadvantage to the status quo. Now, the second possibility they could argue is they said our studies were flawed because of the fact that they looked at people who were easy to rehabilitate, and therefore the statistics may be flawed. However, this is not the case. The Government Accountability Office looked recently, at the beginning of this year, at all of the studies done on drug courts to date, and they identified which ones were the studies that were flawed and which were the studies that were not flawed. In today's debate round, we will only quote the studies that were not flawed. which are the Breaking the Cycle program, the Hillsborough County Adult Court, the Florida, the Baltimore City Drug Court, the Queens Misdemeanor Treatment Court, the MADCE study, the Multnomah County Drug Court, and the Breaking the Cycle program. And if you look at this list here in the GOA study, all of these reported a reduction in crime and drug use. So as you can see, in all the studies that were not flawed, drug use was severely decreased. Now, the next thing I'd like to address is their cost argument. They said that cost would not, in fact, be decreased. Now, if you look at the part of their evidence that they did not read, they were basing this on the preliminary results of the MADCE study. However, the final results of the MADCE study came out at the beginning of this year, which say, quote, drug courts return a net benefit of $6,208 per participant, or $2 for every $1 of cost. So if you look at the final part of their quote, what they were quoting was the preliminary results of a study that the final results differ significantly. In fact, by quoting this, they have agreed that this study was done well. Their quote said that most studies were flawed, but that the MADCE study was not flawed. So I'm going to quote the MADCE study in numerous parts of the remainder of my speech because they have already agreed that this study was not flawed. It is the most large-scale study done on drug courts to date. Now, the second study I'm going to quote is the Government Accountability Office study that I mentioned recently, which looked at all of the studies done about drug courts to this day, and they indicate that drug courts save an average of approximately $10,000 per participant, which is actually greater than the MADCE study, but either way, it is a net benefit of savings. And when applied to the millions of offenders in the system, this results in billions of dollars in savings. Now, the next thing I'd like to address is the points that were ignored by the negative team, the advantages given to those who actually succeed in drug courts. They talk a lot about those who fail and would go back to prison. But what they ignored is the 70% of people who succeed in drug courts and are rehabilitated. As the MADCE study says, quote, drug court participants are significantly less likely to relapse. End quote. And then this results in two advantages. One is reduced crime. As the MADCE study also says, drug court participants commit less crime after participating in the program. We found that the 18 months after enrolling in the study, drug court participants committed significantly less crime than comparison members. End quote. They're committing less crime, which increases public safety. And the fact that they're no longer using drugs changes their lives. We would also like to present an evidence standard in today's debate round. We have quoted the Government Accountability Office, which summarized all of the studies done to date on drug courts. They have quoted no actual studies except for the preliminary, the old results of the MADCE study. We would like to bring up an evidence standard. They may be able to bring up people who have an opinion, but they need actual studies that have been scientifically done to prove their points, not mere advocates that have opinions. We have quoted every single study ever done on drug courts. I would like to close with a quote from the MADCE study. Drug courts work, so ensure that provisions are made to fund their existence. This is the conclusion of the study that they, in fact, quoted in their speech. Thank you. I now stand ready for cross-examination.
Speaker?
Right.
Okay, first off, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How about you?
I'm doing fine. I'm going to start with the end of your speech with a few questions. You had some evidence talking about how for every $1 we save $2, I believe.
Absolutely. The MADCE study.
Did that study include the double? That study was looking at the people who successfully completed the program, correct?
Well, we can go back to that quote if you want.
Okay.
It says.
But since it was talking about how you saved for $1 for everybody.
No, it's for each person that participates in the program, which averages out to about $2 for every $1 spent.
So even if they participate and fail and go back to prison, how
it takes that into account. It's a very comprehensive study. It saves more on the people who succeed, obviously, than it saves on the people who fail. But it averages this number out to $2 for every $1 spent.
$2 for every $1 spent. And what drug courts was that looking at when it did that study?
You can look at the study if you'd like.
Okay. Okay, was this the entire thing?
That's it, right?
I know, but was it? Okay. Sure, I'll have to. But I'm going to go back to the standard of your speech. And you talked about how our plan just have to show any net benefit, correct?
Right. I believe our plan shows significant net benefit, billions of dollars in saving, and millions of lives changed.
Well, doesn't the resolution
However,
state
I believe that
significant reform? A significant.
Yes, and it's a significant reform. I agree with that. However, I believe that it makes sense that if our plan is beneficial, it should be passed.
So even if you gain, for instance, if you had $1.01 of advantages and $1 of disadvantages, it would still be worth it?
I would say it would still be worth it. You're saving a cent.
It would still be worth the time of Congress and implementation just for that 1 cent?
Absolutely. However, I believe that our plan has significant advantages, as I stated earlier. Although I do believe that any net benefits would be beneficial, I believe that our plan also has significant
I'm going to go down to your extra topicality argument in response to mine. You talked about how, well, it's a federal reform, okay? Does
Absolutely.
United,
Reform
it's
is
a federal,
verb,
it's
so
a federal
who is doing the
policy,
reforming
correct?
is what
The argument is it's a federal policy, correct?
I'm saying that the federal government is making the reform, which is what
Okay.
the resolution states must happen.
What is this going to impact? What is the reform going to impact?
The reform is going to affect the states. I talked about this earlier. The word "affect" is nowhere in the resolution. Something is
I know,
allowed to
but
affect the states.
The word
reform
system
must be made by
the
the
word
federal government.
system is in the states, and that reform is changing the state drug court
It
system.
must be a federal reform to the criminal justice system,
Exactly.
which
So
this very clearly is. It's very clearly criminal justice system, and very clearly
you're
clear that the federal government is making the reform.
yes, they're making a reform, but to its criminal justice system.
Additionally, you have no argument against our mandate 1, which should be passed regardless of your topicality argument.
Okay, so you're saying it should be stricken around?
No, I was saying even if it should, our mandate 1 is clearly should be passed, and our mandate 2 should also be passed because it's a federal reform affecting criminal
Okay,
justice
thank you.
policy.
You went on to talk about the vagueness, and you said it's simply impractical for us to list every state. Do you provide a mechanism or just a summarized version of how you're going to divide the money between states?
Sure. Congress will look at which
So
should
it's
go
up
to
to
each state.
Congress.
Sure, absolutely.
You're leaving up to Congress. Okay, thank you.